Hello, welcome. Thanks for joining. Appreciate the viewers and looking forward to streaming by myself. No, just kidding. It's always rough to go at it alone, but anyway, I figured I would keep up with my approximately once a week show. I'm always at a bit of a loss as to what to talk about when it's just me, but whatever. I received a book in the mail called The Book of Five Rings, and I made a meme with it some time ago. And then I realized I actually didn't really know, I don't want to say anything about the contents of the book, but I was quite unfamiliar with it and admittedly just sort of used it conveniently for a meme. And so I thought, nah, well, maybe I should at least have some familiarity with a book if I'm going to cite it as evidence of something. That's definitely prudent. And then past that, I'm trying to write my own stuff, which is going about as bad as anybody could imagine. So I actually did one thing I can provide to the interested listener is a link to my. Hey Skyworks, nice to see you. Link to my blog, Heckin' Blog Reno, where I've uploaded the latest draft of my intro to panpsychism / a proof of panpsychism. And I'm on StreamYards today. As per the request of the audience, if anyone wants to join, the link is in the chat. And I'm just pulling up the link so that I can throw the link to my blog in the chat there. Hopefully, hey, Arbane's Sword of Agility. How's it going? I've been better, but trucking. Putting one foot in front of the other, as my father likes to say. So, all right. if you go to this page that I'm about to link. Hey, Anders. Thanks for joining. All right. So, top of the page, link is empirical panpsychism, and you can download that. It's a Word document. If there's a different form, let me know. It's easier. I don't like to clog it up with them. I don't like to clutter stuff with a bunch of like extraneous files and whatnot. So I know the cool thing now is the Google Docs. I I'm trying to sort of minimize the barrier to entry, so I feel like something from WordPress is more likely to be downloaded than a Google Doc. Like I feel like a lot of people just wouldn't click that for security reasons. Maybe I'm wrong. Please let me know in the chat. Always good to have feedback. So I'm having some fun with StreamYards. I can take breaks now. It's hard. And one of the reasons it's hard for me to stream solo is just, 'cause I guess I get dry mouth and I just need to take sips of water occasionally. And I don't like the sound of glugging on camera. It's just a personal preference, and I'll be like sucking it down. So I've got this music now that I can just play. So if I ever just need a quick break, I can do that, and then it's not so cringe. Now, personally, I'm assuming most people find the dropouts in audio cringy, both from habituation to radio and smooth and all that, but also there's that ding that goes off where it's like, did the stream end? Do I need to like, is it going to auto play to some Jordan fucking Peterson shit or whatever? Do I need to move? It's very stressful, I can imagine. Anders says that they need to look up the word panpsychism. Oh, that's where you're wrong, buddy. Just kidding. It's always good. Okay, I'd say definitions are a good start, but you are going to run into problems the minute you think the definition is an endpoint. Kind of turns into the convo of like, well, yes, Wikipedia is authoritative. Okay, well, if everything is just a citation in a dictionary, what are we even having a conversation for? Just make every single link that anyone ever sends is a Wikipedia. And that way you can just never ever talk to anyone. And that way you'll never ever get hurt. Which we all know is the most important thing in the world. Having fun all the time and maximizing pleasure. So if you go to like I went with a definition that's on Wikipedia. I even cited it. I've got 3 endnotes in that latest one. And yeah, it's a position that everything has a mind or mind-like property. Okay, so what is that? And if it was me and I was just, talking to someone who had never ever had any introduction to this stuff, I would maybe talk about solipsism. Because in a way that solipsism is a form of panpsychism. Now I know a lot of people aren't going to agree with that. Because solipsism is like there's this straw man of it that I think would be fairly easy to disprove with a least action argument. You could imagine, for logical or logical floggability or whatever it is, you can imagine a world where you're a brain in a vat and da 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 da. It's like some sort of weird Doctor Who shit. I don't know. You can imagine that, but the way I look at it is like the energetic cost. So this costs, like presumably it costs energy to run this like wire heading brain in a jar thing. Now, I don't care about your wire heading brain in a jar aesthetics unless you can prove to me why it doesn't violate minimum energy. So that's I wouldn't take that. That's sort of my own little aside. Ignore everything I just said. Let's go back to panpsychism. Mind-like quality. Let's rephrase it to what is actually solipsism, which I'm about to share. Um, one's mind is sure to exist. Okay, so the last time I checked this, that was actually not what it said. It said that it's the view that the self is all that can be known to exist. So it sort of gets switched around a lot on Wiki. I'm not sure why, but so I guess self is actually the literal translation. And then we have only one's mind is sure to exist. Okay, so I still think that this is a bit of a straw man because you don't have to like use solipsism, quote unquote, in your reasoning. I do. I think it works really well, but that's just me. But it sounds moronic to have people arguing against a straw man in perpetuity. And so to say that the self is all that can be known to exist, it's like, well, reframe. There's some definition of that term that like fits that, and that's what it's aiming at. It's trying to get you to think past language within language. So there's all sorts of tricks like that. The philosophy, language games, religion language games, all sorts of various. I mean, to call them a game, it probably sounds not not good, but who doesn't enjoy games? So Anders says that they think panpsychism is true and mind is grounded in something like the Wolfram graph. Yeah, well, the idea would be that everything is grounded in the mind, kind of with solipsism. That I still think that what's here is is not really charitably representing the view. I guess you could say it's that the mind is the most certain thing to exist. So one's direct experience is the most certain thing to them because in some sense you are your direct experience, or at least it feels like it's part of you. There may be something else is unclear what that is, but I don't see how you could argue with the notion that within your own perception, your perception is the first thing. Within okay, forget what I just said. within within the hierarchical stack of judgments that you're making, your own mind is integral to that stack. And allegations of mind independence, well, that's I'm sorry, there's a arguably impossible proof burden on an assertion like that. So it could be egoism too, possibly. I try not to go into egoism because there's an impersonal ego that I just don't think is gonna land at this point. I don't think it's gonna translate. In time, it'll be more clear why there's a need for that because it's not so much about a particular concept, it's about a number of concepts undergoing permutations through a greater space of more or less fixed cardinality. But my definition that I'm using is that the self is all that can be known to exist. And it's also true in my system that everything has a mind or mind like property. And so basically, I'm just trying to make every definition, as many definitions as possible, true. And obviously, some definitions just are not possible to be true because they contradict other definitions. So mostly, you're going to find that my definitions of things will accord with most reasonable interpretations of these phenomena. So so the idea with something being fundamental is that there's a sort of metaphysical inheritance there that in some sense you can explain. Like I always just point to the math example. So what are there's a misconception that the Euclidean axioms don't tell us anything because you can't prove an axiom. That doesn't mean you can't get information from an axiom. That's like this sentence is not true. Is this sentence true? It's like, okay, let's move beyond this incredibly rigid dichotomy, obviously not capable of encompassing the idea. So, yeah, let's get on with this awesome book that I have acquired as a way to, number one, talk about some awesome stuff in martial arts that is pretty fun and interesting to me, but also hopefully get better at writing because I am quite terrible at it. I don't have much practice, and I have a bunch of practice writing in a way that people don't enjoy reading, called the passive voice. So, Nagarjuna is saying that everything is mind or mine only. That's great. I don't know that that was said, but again, if someone doesn't accept the authority of an ancient person, you're sort of preaching to the choir. And there is a place for citations, which is technically what I'm doing right now. I'm citing an expert by reading their book. There's room for that, but really we should be mostly focused on ideas. So I'm always a bit suspicious when it's listing pundits. It's like I don't give a shit. I don't even care about my own stuff past the fun of the experience of it. So caring that some person, weirdo, wacko person, matters. It's no, it's the ideas that really matter. But sometimes people really embody ideas well. And so those people matter in the context of the ideas that they embody. So yeah, the idea with fundamentals is that you can explain something in terms of other concepts, but those other concepts are um, like crypto invoking the fundamental concept. The idea is that every concept is derivative of your fundamental concept. So you can take language, every concept is derivative of sound. So you can say, well, there's this word that doesn't have any sound in it, but it's like, is there? Same with math. There, it's constructed within axioms. So yeah, the idea with a fundamental, and again, this is my understanding. A lot of people aren't going to agree with this because they don't understand metaphysics. But when you have something fundamental, in explaining it, you're presupposing it. So you can try to prove like it is because language isn't constructed to be truth apt. You can definitely construct something that looks like a proof of a fundamental concept. Is it a legitimate proof though? I would say if you can go into the axioms and actually find the thing, like if you can present some simpler version of that, which is a subset of that, well, then it's derivative. So it's not quite an appeal to authority fallacy. You have to be careful with authority because not every school accepts the exact same authority. And so there's, being like the authority over math versus the authority over experience versus the authority over definitions, those are different purviews. So it's a bit reductive to say an appeal to authority fallacy. There's a couple things to consider. Number one, the ideas are what are authoritative. So what makes somebody authoritative is their command of ideas. So you have this solipsism of ideas where in our own mind, our perception comes first, but from the perspective of the concept comes first. So if the concept is the determinant over the authority, well, in a way, if we're not a concept ourselves, we're going to somehow embody a fallacy. Ha ha ha. But anyway, authority is complicated because reasoning is about fundamentally an appeal to some type of an authority. And I think a lot of disagreements are misunderstanding that, or because people misunderstand it, or because they know it and they just don't want to admit it because they want the edge associated with, well, I don't actually appeal to authority. I have like this, I'm enlightened by my own intelligence type people. I'm sure we all know those kinds of people. Preface. So I'm going to start with a book. The Book of Five Rings, a classic text on the Japanese way of the sword by Miyamoto Musashi. I'll read the back. The Book of Five Rings is one of the most insightful texts on the subtle arts of confrontation and victory to emerge from Asian culture. Written not only for martial artists, but for anyone who wants to apply the timeless principles of this text to their life, the book analyzes the process of struggle and mastery over conflict that underlies every level of human interaction. The Book of Five Rings was composed in 1643 by the famed duelist and undefeated samurai Miyamoto Musashi. Thomas Cleary's translation is immediately accessible, with an introduction that presents the spiritual background of the warrior tradition. Along with Musashi's text, Cleary translates here another important Japanese classic on leadership and strategy, the Book of Family Traditions on the Art of War by Yagyu Nori, which highlights the ethical and spiritual insights of Taoism and Zen as they apply to the way of the warrior. Preface. All right, I'm just having a look in the chat here. Someone could be mastered of ideas and still come up with complete rubbish. Or somebody could be a master of ideas and say some stuff that is tricky and flub some people up severely and get them to say incredibly dumb shit, harvest the shit out of it, refine it, make milk out of it, make cream out of it, make soma out of it, make memes out of that. And then you have that little thing called regret for defying that person. That you get to live with little treasure, oyster, make it into whatever those things are called, pearls. There you go. Mind is fundamental for extrapolating ideas. Whether mind is fundamental to existence itself is questionable. Sure, it's questionable, but you're invoking it by questioning it. So you are using your own mind to question whether mind is fundamental. So you've invoked a mind. The question is, what's the connection between what you're calling your mind and the universe? So to me, panpsychism is just with regards to, like, if we're analogized as a watch made by a blind watchmaker, well, the nature is just the blind watchmaker. So it has some sort of fundamental computational intelligence, which gets shorthanded as mind. And so you could take that to its logical conclusion and say, well, you're just really kind of shooting yourself in the foot to deny that mind is fundamental. But you're also severely limiting your range of achievement if you cling too much to a particular definition of mind, because a person who has no experience exploring mental concepts, how could you have the right concept of mind in the sense? Because there's only really one sense in which the mind is fundamental. There's tons of interpretations of the word mind that's absolutely not fundamental. Like, imagine, the straw man where everything's just happening in the literal brain. Creepy, gross, zombie garbage. But anyway, preface: the science of martial arts, called the individual school of two skies, is something that I have spent many years refining. Now, wishing to reveal it in a book for the first time, I have ascended Mount Iwato in Higo province of Kyushu. Please excuse the pronunciation. Bowing to heaven, paying respects to Kannon, I face the Buddha. I am Shinmen Musashi no Kami, Fujiwara no Genshin, a warrior born in the province of Harima, now 60 years old. I have set my mind on the science of martial arts since my youth long ago. I was 13 years old when I had my first duel. On that occasion, I won over my opponent, a martial artist named Arima Kihei of the New School of Accuracy. At 16 years of age, I beat a powerful martial artist called Akiyama of Taijima province. When I was 21, I went to the capital city and met martial artists from all over the country. Although I engaged in numerous duels, never did I fail to attain victory. Arbane Sword says, if there was no living things in the universe, like a little bit after the Big Bang, is there mind in the universe? Big Bang's not compatible with mind. Big Bang's in a creation ex nihilo narrative. And what I'm saying is uncreated universe due to conservation of energy constraints. Death has been the norm for billions of years on our planet alone, but the future may be different than the past. Well, I think there's a lot more evidence for life than death. And my proof of that is that I have these succulents that I don't plant them. They don't have anything going on. They're just basically air plants with tiny little clumps of dirt, and I spray them with some water, and they are not dead. In the sense that if I put them in the ground, they're going to start getting bigger. So the idea that death pervades the universe is like saying because cars break down, then there's no such thing. Then there aren't any cars. No, that doesn't follow. Cars break down. We still make cars. Then there's a bunch of cars, and you're coming back. You're coming right back as a probably much worse car if things don't improve soon. Descartes came to the conclusion that the only thing he couldn't doubt was the fact that he was thinking. Yeah, so that's very problematic because there's a presupposition, there's an agentive presupposition that is completely unexplored is the I. So I think, therefore I am. What's the I? You're not saying what it is, you're just sort of inserting it twice in this odd self-reference. So that's kind of a good place to start. Descartes is right around the same time as this guy. There hasn't been much progress intellectually since the 1600s on the level that would need to happen for civilization to be progressing. Because, like, a bunch of intellectual stuff being known by like three people and a bunch of computers, that doesn't mean people like that literally means people aren't benefiting from it. So it has to be a level of personal benefit where the person is convinced it's worthwhile benefit for to proceed forward, as in like part of the whole inheritance. Let me continue with this book, talking about a very famous and celebrated master of, it's called kenjutsu, the Japanese way of the sword. After that, I traveled from province to province, meeting martial artists of the various schools. Although I dueled more than 60 times, never once did I lose. That all took place between the time I was 13 years old and the time I was 29. When I passed the age of 30 and reflected on my experiences, I realized that I had not been victorious because of consummate attainment of martial arts. Perhaps it was because I had an inherent skill for the science and had not deviated from natural principles. It may also have been due to shortcomings in the martial arts of other schools. In any case, I subsequently practiced day and night in order to attain an even deeper principle, and spontaneously came upon the science of martial arts. I was about 50 years old at that time. Since then, I have passed the time with no science into which to inquire, trusting in the advantages of military science as I turn it into the sciences of all arts and skills. I have no teacher in anything. Now, in composing this book, I have not borrowed the old sayings of Buddhism or Confucianism, nor do I make use of old stories from military records or books on military science. With heaven and cannon for mirrors, I take up the brush and begin to write at 4 a.m. on the night of the 10th day of the 10th month of 1643. Okay, so that was the preface. Hi, Titan, thanks for joining. And C. McG, also thanks for joining. And anyone I might have missed, thanks for joining. Have I heard of the concept Sugiguri? It's a mad idea. They were tough times. No, I haven't heard about it. So at this point, I'm just thinking like my first idea, other than a reminder that I don't like talking about myself, is that uh, I could possibly just throw, I could just remove the key details from that intro and replace the key details from my life. Be like, I always wanted to like be able to prove reincarnation, so just replace kenjutsu with proving reincarnation. Yeah, so Anders is asking about panpsychism, mind being all that there is. We have to just be careful because what definition are we using? So if we haven't fixed a definition and then we invoke two definitions in one definition, like the mind being fundamental and the mind being all that exists, is not quite the same thing. So I would say that there's limitations to words, and I think it's a lot better to just understand the concept. So, is there such a thing as a fixed boundary? And the answer is no, not materially, and we can know that because of something called thermodynamics. And so in thermodynamics, vibration is fundamental, and then that the motion of that vibration is used to model a bunch of things in math, but in reality, it's never the case that a system has no motion, which is that's what's required for there to be a fixed boundary, for there to be uh, no motion in the boundary. And so that's not the case. And I can even prove that a system, remember, if we're just talking about empiricism, it's about what's observable. I can prove that a system that's at absolute zero, which would be the condition for zero motion or having a boundary, that's unobservable because as soon as you observe it, observation is interferential. You've disturbed it from the state that it was in. And if you need to probe a system, which is always interferential, aka it always changes it, there's a serious limit as to what it even means to measure something. So that just I'm on top of all the abstractions that I've gone into, there's an additional layer of abstraction I haven't even talked about. And that's because I don't want to discourage people. I know stuff's already hard enough as it is, but mind being all that there is, that has a too much probably metaphysical inheritance to be true from an empirical standpoint, is my point. It'd be a lot safer to just say vibration. So that's the most fundamental thing. What is that? Well, some type of movement, and it's been called fluxion. Fluxion. And then later on, you get stuff like derivatives, where there's a bit of an issue because the concept of motion is sort of lost. Math and physics are sort of blended together in this understanding with calculus that causes a bit of an issue in conceptualization. So this is the way to look at it. Forget the words. Okay, we're saying two different things. Okay, so when we're coming at this from the perspective of empiricism, we're trying to figure out what's out there. What can we know about what's out there? I.e., quote, mind independent, if there is such thing, apart from ourselves. The thing we can know about that is, well, that's vibration. And we know that because temperature describes all systems, and temperature is indicative of motion. So everything accepts a thermodynamic decomposition. That's panpsychism. That's my form of panpsychism, is just a way to take that and eventually get to what we're calling consciousness, which is, in my opinion, best described as a thermodynamic effect. And so is the mind not the brain? It's like, I don't know where that idea came from. It's certainly not it doesn't make much sense to me, because then you have to answer where the brain came from, and the answer that I've been given on that is evolution. That's not an answer. That's just one word. And I understand that the brain is certainly an evolved organ, but if you can't walk me through how that happened in a plausible way. I'm just going to go with my panpsychism where I don't have this problem, which is the whole point of it. So, two things: mind being fundamental in the sense that vibration is fundamental, and vibration is fundamental attribute of mind. Whatever you can say, mind is fundamental, but we don't want to misrepresent our ideas to people who have no clue what we're talking about. So, we don't want the idea that electrons have feelings. That's stupid, and that the universe is a giant brain. It's also very dumb and clearly a misrepresentation of the position. So, two things are important in the position. One, there's a fundamental vibrational nature to matter. And it is this vibrational nature which gives rise to what we are calling our consciousness. And then we have, quote, solipsism, i.e., the non clown version of solipsism, which is that the fundamental level of our capacity to make value judgments is our own perception. That's where it starts and stops. The question is now, what next? So those two things, no problem. And then the question is, what next? That's where the interpretation comes in. And understanding, first of all, that interpretations are for purposes. They're not just floating out magically in the ether. It's a implementation for particular purpose. Anders says they like to use the term mind for foundation of reality and mind for the human limited mind. So there are some cases where it makes sense to do that, and other cases where it's just there's no point. So it's all down to put everything to the side and then reconstruct the system as dynamic boundaries, which are varying minimally within a particular range. But the range of the range varies because of something called evolution. Matter and energy, including the brain, is second order reality, and mind is the first order reality. Interesting. All right, so we'll go on. I'm not going to read the whole book, but I just thought I'd get a start. So, just to recap here, I'm reading the Book of Five Rings. I have only gotten 2 pages in so far because I'm also always trying to work on getting better at streaming, which clearly I can use some practice on streaming solo, as well as research into how to write a book for my own ideas, inspiration, as well as I made a meme that cited Five Rings due to having my own Five Rings-esque type doctrine and wanting to pad my resume, so to speak. I threw that in there, and then I thought, well, I should probably at least have a passing familiarity with that which my memes are hearkening back to. So, if you want to define consciousness as something that comes from the brain, then yes. If consciousness comes from the brain, then consciousness comes from the brain. If you want a definition that accords with the least action principle, you have to only put boundaries in a place that makes sense, not just that feels right in your own subjectivity, because it turns out your own subjectivity is irrelevant to science, which you'd think would be obvious, but for some reason isn't. And that's because of something called philosophy and cogito ergo sum, which places a ridiculous amount of certainty on subjectivity that is unwarranted. Under says consciousness, which is a state of the mind, observes the material world, and the material world doesn't observe consciousness. So that's my take on first and second order. It's not that hard to observe consciousness, or at least evidence of consciousness. Since consciousness is the thing doing the observing, it doesn't really make sense to define the thing that observes as observed necessarily. So again, it's very complicated because I don't want to say word games, but it doesn't really work to presume your own conclusion and then double down on rhetoric and not listen to the opposing side. Because I've basically always been saying the exact same thing, and it's always worked. And so consciousness either is intrinsic, or it's been intrinsic and then for the last 100 years it comes from the brain. And now it comes from the brain forever. So you decide which one of those is more likely. I was reading somewhere even the Greeks said that consciousness came from the heart, so that's another model. And it has some utility because it's the heart is the first sign of life. So you could say it's the floor of in some sense, the ground of everything else. The heartbeat is the fundamental node of the mind when it's embodied. So you can look at it that way. That wouldn't negate panpsychism because the idea that it's an either or, that's actually another misapprehension in logic of absolutist, binary, cruel thinking. So leads to just unthinkable cruelty. So I'll continue reading. The Earth Scroll. Martial arts are the warrior's way of life. Commanders in particular should practice these arts, and soldiers must also know this way of life. In the present day, there are no warriors with certain knowledge of the way of martial arts. First, let us illustrate the way of life. Helping people. Confusion is a way of reforming culture. For the physician, healing is a way of life. A poet teaches the art of poetry. Others pursue fortune telling, archery, or various other arts and crafts. People practice the ways to which they are inclined, developing individual. Few people are fond of the martial way of life. That is very true. Most people have no principles, no discipline, and are more or less completely self-oriented. Arbane Sword says, some Buddhists, though, yeah, I think I've been over this, that the heart is the mind. It's just a question of what is the theory, what is the model useful for? So heart is quite useful for living tissue. Burden on the brain. Because to me, it causes more confusion than it solves. So burden of proof is on the claimant. So to me, the most absolutely useful one is panpsychism. And then heart is a good approximation for living tissue. And that'd be about it. So past that, I'm not really sold on any of these models. So yeah, very nice to see some of these ideas floating around and people hopefully opening their minds, being open to progress and ideas. Because, that's what's really important for evolution of society. To increase what makes society great, which is the capacity to communicate clearly, which increases the capacity to share meaning and have intimacy and build trust. And how can that possibly ever be bad? Unless you're a liar. Others pursue fortune telling, archery, or various other arts and crafts. People practice the ways to which they are inclined, developing individual preferences. Few people are oh, sorry, I've already said this part, but yeah, can validate most people. Not a big fan of a disciplined way of life, though they do enjoying the benefits of a disciplined way of life. Well, that's right. First of all, the way of warriors means familiarity with both cultural and martial arts. Even if they are clumsy at this, individual warriors should strengthen their own martial arts as much as practical in their circumstances. That is a very good point. People usually think that all warriors think about is being ready to die. As far as the way of death is concerned, it is not limited to warriors. Mendicants, women, farmers, and even those below them know their duty, are ashamed to neglect it, and resign themselves to death. There is no distinction in this respect. The martial way of life practiced by warriors is based on excelling others in anything and everything, whether by victory in an individual duel or by winning a battle with several people. One thinks of serving the interests of one's employer, of serving one's own interests, of becoming well known and socially established, This is all possible by the power of martial arts. Yet there will be people in the world who think that even if you learn martial arts, this will not prove useful when a real need arises. Regarding that concern, the true science of martial arts means practicing them in such a way that they will be useful at any time, and to teach them in such a way that they will be useful in all things. Our Rain Sword asks if we could go over Sun and Steel art action and ritual death. I'm not a big not big on the whole ghoulish stuff. I more or less not to not sure I want to go in a ghoulish direction. More interested in going in a hopeful, happy, loving, uplifting, upbeat, super fun, happy time, intellectual circle of friends type thing. Yeah, I'll read on a little more. Hi, Mark Smith. Nice to see you. In China and Japan, practitioners of this science have been referred to as masters of martial arts. Warriors should not fail to learn this science. People who make a living as martial artists these days only deal with swordsmanship. The priests of the Kashima and Kantori shrines in Hitachi province have established such schools, claiming their teachings to have been transmitted from the gods, and travel around from province to province, passing them on to people. But this is actually a recent phenomenon. Among the arts and crafts spoken of since ancient times, the so-called art of the advantage has been included as a craft. So once we are talking about the art of the advantage, it cannot be limited to swordsmanship alone. Even swordsmanship itself can hardly be known by considering only how to win by the art of the sword alone. Without question, it is impossible to master military science thereby. Okay, so does this sound like a good way of writing for me to attempt to emulate? Because I'll be honest, just as far in as I am right now, it sounds a little dated. I think it's really good, but it's like just this last bit, I guess to me sounded more dated. Thanks for everyone for your patience. I just have to take a quick break every so often and just rest my voice and take a little drink. Anders says the brain is an object, not a subject. I find those words are a little bit tricky because God's eye view, which is this hypothetical extra universal perspective that doesn't exist, but it's really useful. Um, Objects and subjects, what's that? An object appears to require a fixed boundary, which we already talked about doesn't, is at least it's not empirical. And then a subject, well, it's the whole like featherless chicken problem. That's actually quite challenging to define a subject. Not to say that we shouldn't keep those concepts, but there may be something in those concepts that holds back from useful starting point for being able to build physics up from something very simple. And the idea that it's very, just to come back to this brain thing for a second, like it's honestly mind-boggling to me. It's inconceivable that someone could think consciousness comes from the brain. Because I mean, it's, I guess we're just not talking about the same thing when we're saying consciousness. I assume what the people that believe that are saying is that it feels like thinking comes from the frontal lobes. The direction of thinking, I suppose, is moving forward from the brain towards the forehead. You know, if I'm going to be charitable, that is literally your only evidence, is a impression. And then an assertion that there's no evidence of consciousness without a brain, but by any reasonable interpretation of consciousness, there's tons of consciousness without brain. So I've thought about this a bit. I don't tend to use that dichotomy, subject object, at least as a fundamental reasoning tool. But if you want to start with something that's not completely off, because eventually you can take the limit of an object to be a non object, because a really big sphere is almost nothing if you're inside it. So you could say that the subjective is a subset of the objective, and you can think of, molecules as objects. Okay, well, we come from molecules and we're subjects. So the certainty of a subject is not the same as the certainty of the structure of molecules. That's somehow more certain. That's fundamentally what it's saying. These causal straw mans of emergence become tedious at some point because people who disagree will shove in their own metaphysical supposition about temporality and then demand that you essentially walk into a trap. It's like, okay, at some point, who wants to engage with that? Why do they call the bowl of fruit the subject? Because the art is depicting a topic. So, in that sense, the art as matter is an object. Okay, so if I like, so there's art as an idea and art as matter. So take the Mona Lisa for example. If I if okay, if that got destroyed somehow, the idea of Mona Lisa would still exist, and the influence of it as art goes way beyond its material presence. So we're talking about a subject, it's what's depicted on the object is the topic of the art, for which a synonym is subject. So that's why you have to be kind of careful with English, is that its strength is its weakness. So it's got tons of words. It's super easy to get a grasp on for a beginner. The order of your sentences doesn't have to be spot on to make sense, but at the same time, we have confusion that can come in where it takes extremely long to explain why it's the subject of an art piece than not an object. And even that explanation, I'm kind of thinking like, to a large extent, it's a matter of convention, aka nominalism, just no meaning at all behind the term, just random. What they call arbitrary, but I like to call random, but then I know random's not a thing, but I've got my like pseudo random thing in my hierarchical certainty thing that it doesn't matter. All right. As I see society, people make the arts into commercial products. They think of themselves as commodities and also make implements as items of commerce. Distinguishing the superficial and the substantial, I find this attitude has less reality than decoration. The field of, so this is basically the cargo cult phenomenon. We're basically in a time loop since the 1600s. It's kind of hard to unsee once you see it. Okay. The field of martial arts is particularly rife with flamboyant showmanship, with commercial popularization and profiteering on the part of both those who teach the science and those who study it. The result of this, as someone said, that amateuristic martial arts are a source of serious wounds. Generally speaking, there are four walks of life: the ways of the knight, the farmer, the artisan, and the merchant. First is the way of the farmer. Farmers prepare all sorts of agricultural tools and spend the years constantly attending to the changes in the four seasons. This is the way of the farmer. Second is the way of the merchant. Those who manufacture wine obtain the various implements required and make a living from the profit they gain according to quality. Whatever the business, merchants make a living from the profits they earn according to their particular status. This is the way of the merchant. Third, in regard to the warrior knight, that path involves constructing all sorts of weapons and understanding the various properties of weapons. This is imperative for warriors. Failure to master weaponry and comprehend the specific advantages of each weapon would seem to indicate a lack of cultivation in a member of a warrior house. Fourth is the way of the artisan. In terms of the way of the carpenter, this involves skillful construction of all sorts of tools, knowing how to use each tool skillfully, drawing up plans correctly by means of the square and the ruler, making a living by diligent practice of the craft. These are the four walks of life. So you notice how there's lists in this book. This book is so far a list of stuff that led me to write the book. Then a list of stuff about martial arts being cringe because it's overly commercialized. I'm just saying that, like, if it's not really shouldn't be too shocked if my book's full of lists. Just saying. The whole point of the teachings is that books are productive. So what's the book going to convey if not that? Hi, Serge DeNovo. Thanks for posting. Nice to see you. Honor says Leo Gura has a great video called something like that, Why Brains Don't Exist, where I got much of the first, second order ideas from. Okay, yeah, that guy I find a bit unnerving. All right, back to the book. These are the four walks of life, of knights, farmers, artisans, and merchants. I will illustrate the science of martial arts by likening it to the way of the carpenter. The carpenter is used as a metaphor in reference to the notion of house. We speak of aristocratic houses, military houses, houses of the arts. We speak of a house collapsing or a house continuing. And we speak of such a tradition, style, or house. Since we use the expression house, therefore, I have employed the way of the master carpenter as a metaphor. The word for carpenter is written with characters meaning great skill or master plan. Since the science of martial arts involves great skill in master planning, I'm writing about it in terms of comparison with carpentry. If you want to learn the science of martial arts, meditate on this book. Let the teacher be the needle, let the student be the thread, and practice unremittingly. So I guess now I'm thinking or wondering if there's some sort of metaphor that I can use for my understanding. Doubtful. So I'll just keep reading. As the master carpenter is the overall organizer and director of the carpenters, it is the duty of the master carpenter to understand the regulations of the country, find out the regulations of the locality, and attend to the regulation of the master carpenter's own establishment. The master carpenter, knowing the measurements and designs of all sorts of structures, employs people to build houses. In this respect, the master carpenter is the same as the master warrior. When sorting out timber for building a house, that which is straight, free from knots, and of good appearance can be used for front pillars. That which has some knots but is straight and strong can be used for rear pillars. That which is somewhat weak yet has no knots and looks good is variously used for door sills, lintels, doors, and screens. That which is knotted and crooked, but nevertheless strong, is used thoughtfully in consideration of the strength of the various members of the house. Then the house will last a long time. Yeah, that's a metaphor for some type of synchronously operating intelligence. Sounds like the grand architect. Even knotted, crooked, and weak timber can be made into scaffolding and later used for firewood. As the master carpenter directs the journeyman, he knows their various levels of skill and gives them appropriate tasks. Some are assigned to the flooring, some to the doors and screens, some to the sills, lintels, and ceilings, and so on. He has the unskilled set out floor joists and gets those even less skilled to carve wedges. When the master carpenter exercises discernment in the assignment of jobs, the work progresses smoothly. Efficiency and smooth progress, prudence in all matters, recognizing true courage, recognizing different levels of morale, instilling confidence, and realizing what can and cannot be reasonably expected. Such are the matters on the mind of the master carpenter. The principle of martial arts is like this. This is absolutely relatable for me because I always want to make sure there's a maximum potential for acquiring teaching. So that's efficiency. And there's really no end to the contemplation of an efficient teaching. It's an ongoing thing because of evolution. So the better you are at teaching, the more knowledge evolves. So the better you have to become at teaching just to keep up with the fruits of your labor. Under says Dalai Lama said that reincarnation is real, but it's not personal. If you heard correctly, maybe some kind of collective reincarnation. There's a lot of weird quotes going on around places. So I think it's important to turn inwards and ask ourselves how we feel about things. Does it seem reasonable that personality comes from nothing and is just a random mishmash, gurgling puddle of brain? Or is it a pre existing harmonic field that makes matter its bitch as it consumes it for all time? In the Buddha film with Keanu Reeves, he says to himself, "Architect, do not build your house again." Then he was enlightened. Wow. You know what tells me, nothing says deep knowledge like pulling metaphysical tropes from the Matrix. All right, so I think I've kind of lost my page in this book here. Oh yeah, it was about burning crooked wood or something. Here we go. The science of martial arts. Speaking in terms of carpentry, soldiers sharpen their own tools, make various useful implements, and keep them in their utility boxes. Receiving instructions from a master carpenter, they hew pillars and beams with adzes, shave floors with and shelving with planes, and even carve open work and bas relief, making sure the measurements are correct. They see to all the necessary tasks in an efficient manner. This is the rule for carpentry. When one has developed practical knowledge of all the skills of the craft, eventually one can become a master carpenter oneself. An essential habit for carpenters is to have sharp tools and keep them whetted. It is up to the carpenter to use these tools masterfully, even making such things as miniature shrines, bookshelves, tables, lampstands, cutting boards, and pot covers. Being a soldier is like this. This should be given careful reflection, presumably because there's a long time spent doing nothing when you're a soldier, so it's good to have something to keep your hands busy, like various shrines, bookshelves, and so forth. Necessary accomplishments of a carpenter are avoiding crookedness, getting joints to fit together, skillful planning, avoiding abrasion, and seeing that there is no subsequent warping. If you want to learn this science, then take everything I write to heart and think it over carefully. On the composition of this book in 5 scrolls. Distinguishing 5 courses in order to explain their principles in individual sections, I have written this book in 5 scrolls, entitled Earth, Water, Fire, Wind, and Emptiness. I feel like this is exactly how I write. So obviously that's wrong. But I noticed that this sentence, just saying, does start with a verb. Yeah. There's just so many strange quotes about Buddhism flying around these days. The most I might actually start doing a compilation. Like, my got this meme folder that's memes that are just screenshots. That's getting swole. And yeah, might do that. Just wacko. Let's just see how much people can abuse logic to come to a predetermined conclusion that actually isn't a conclusion of any reasonable line of thinking whatsoever freaking ever. Sunflower says, one issue I had with Buddhism, or generally the concept of reaching nirvana via complete detachment from all worldly things, is that it makes it seem like helping people is a waste of time. What do you mean? It's absolutely not, because you're okay. Don't assume that people understand the religions that they're like using as a thing to seem cool this month. Okay, just saying. A lot of times just something to say. Why would think about that for a second? Okay, so the way I understand it is 4 noble truths. If you want to know what Buddhism is, just go back to the source of it. It's 4 noble truths. So if someone says something that contradicts that, or it seems like it contradicts it, maybe you're wrong and you misunderstood, but maybe that person's wrong too. So always good to just sort of look into it. Maybe you're saying that because there's dependent arising, there's no independent meaning and therefore futility. Okay, if that's how you feel, that the aesthetics of Buddhism just like aren't for you. That doesn't make its metaphysical claims true or false. It's like sort of a neither on that. But I don't see how a view of suffering being fundamental, which is, I mean, that's what the like I can pull it up right now. Very simple. There are like schools, quote unquote, of Buddhism, but fundamentally your 4 noble truths are. I'm going to try to pull it up here. We should be like, I guess I should speak for myself here, but I feel very appreciative to have discussions on religion that aren't acrimonious. So when you can build from a base of agreement, disagreement is sort of less acrimonious, at least to me. So I think it really turns on this concept of suffering. And, to express this in the concept of um, modern philosophy, you'd say like suffering realism. So helping people is not like it actually gives you tons of opportunities to help people because you see everybody as enduring suffering. You understand that everybody endures suffering and you don't just know it on some like superficial level of your brain. You feel it in your very core. So helping people is actually like pretty much the way it feels is like there's no point in taking birth if there's no chance of helping anybody, which is ultra sad because being alive has tons of awesome opportunities. But, frankly, if I can't help people, yet there is something somewhat meaningless to it. So, futility and meaning and stuff like that, those are concepts that evolve in us as we go forward. But, like, if you're going to benefit from something like Buddhism, it sort of assumes that you're already at a point where you maybe don't want to be like a full on monk, but you are pretty convinced that there's something in how you're implementing your beliefs that's creating suboptimal results. And you're using the Buddhism or whatever as a technology to overcome that. So then to make absolute pronouncements with regards to a technology that has a great degree of flexibility in its implementation is sort of betraying a lack of understanding on the topic. Not saying that this applies to you, Sunflower, just saying like don't judge a system based on what some randos are saying about it because they thought it would make them sound cool. Again, not talking about anybody in particular. It's just like these things have like the fashion trend or whatever. I'm sure they'll be the same with panpsychism. In fact, I think there's a quote about like panpsychism being sexed up atheism. Pro tip, it's not. All right, so just looking through the chat here. Andre says they loves the concept of Indra's net in Buddhist philosophy. Yeah, I think for visualization it's pleasant and it's an accessible, pleasant visualization, but it's also incredibly there's basically like you could just keep going with it till you reached your own physical limitation. There's a great deal of development that's possible within simple little concept like that. Sunflower says, so based on these truths, if seeing someone I love suffer makes me suffer, then I should end the dukkha. No, see, that's that's absolutist thinking. So it's not about I gotta go on a crusade. So if you think I gotta go on a crusade against X, that's a mistake if you're drawing that conclusion from Buddhism, because that's just residual absolutist thinking. The West has a lot of absolutist thinking, but even if you're in a culture with non-absolutist thinking, uh, you still have to do quite a bit of work to overcome tendencies towards absolutist thinking. These things that have doctrines associated with them. The doctrines are there because it's hard to overcome absolutist thinking. The conclusion is that every recognition of a moment of suffering is an opportunity for growth. So the idea is that there's growth happening. There's a phase where you're whatever it is before it's a butterfly. You're it's not a maggot. I know it's not a maggot. I can't remember what it is. But anyway, it's the thing that turns into a butterfly. I just take every horrible suffering opportunity as an opportunity for growth and realizing that there will be a point where yeah, thanks, Bubbles. It's caterpillar. It's like, what do you tell a caterpillar who doesn't believe in butterfly? That's how I feel. It's like you want to be the best caterpillar that you can be, because once you're a butterfly, maybe there's going to be something about being a caterpillar that you actually end up missing. Not saying that's the case for me, but it could happen. So there's tons of suffering. And if you're not at a point where Buddhism can help you overcome that suffering, then maybe something else can. And that's it's great, because there's been times where I've had like horrible realizations and then got past them, because I realized there was some way to minimize the suffering based on what I actually thought was this huge setback being actually an asset. Can't be sure if Buddhism is divinic in nature, though it might be spiritual. Well, it's probably a political document. I would look at it as a political document. I don't know if that's helpful. Yeah. So I'll just go back to the book here. Soldiers sharpen their own tools, make various useful implements, and keep them in their utility boxes. I think maybe I already read this part. So let me just check here. I'm just getting so excited about this book that I'm repeating myself. Sorry about that. Okay, I'm almost done the part that I said that I would read. So let's get through that. On the composition of this book in 5 scrolls. Distinguishing 5 courses in order to explain their principles in individual sections, I have written this book in 5 scrolls, entitled Earth, Water, Fire, Wind, and Emptiness. In the Earth Scrolls, an outline of the science of martial arts, the analysis of my individual school. The true science cannot be attained just by mastery of swordsmanship alone. Knowing the small by way of the great, one goes from the shallow to the deep. Ooh, I got tingles just thinking about it. Because the straight path levels the contour of the earth, I call the first one the Earth Scroll. Second is the Water Scroll. Taking water as the basic point of reference, one makes the mind fluid. Water conforms to the shape of the vessel, square or round. It can be a drop, and it can be an ocean. Water has the color of a deep pool of aquamarine. Because of the purity of water, I write about my individual school in this scroll. When you attain certain discernment of the principles of mastering swordsmanship, then when you can defeat one opponent at will, this is tantamount to being able to defeat everyone in the world. The spirit of overcoming others is the same even if there are thousands or tens of thousands of opponents. The military science of commanders is to construe the large scale from the small scale, like making a monumental icon from a miniature model. Such matters are impossible to write about in detail. Problem of induction: to know myriad things by means of one thing is a principle of military science. I write about my individual school in this water scroll. Third is the fire scroll. In this scroll, I write about battle. Fire may be large or small and has a sense of violence, so here I write about matters of battle. The way to do battle is the same whether it is a battle between one individual and another, or a battle between one army and another. You should observe reflectively with overall awareness of the large picture as well as precise attention to small details. Now, I'm totally loving this, because this really sets up a great metaphor with my approach. Because for me, it's just, I know this is going to sound cheesy and probably everyone knows what I'm about to say here, but once you have stood yourself down, and once there are no more big surprises, let's say. It's good to still have a bit of a mystery, but no more big surprises. There you go. All right. Hopefully, didn't lose my spot in the book again here. The large scale is easy to see. The small scale is hard to see. To be specific, it is impossible to reverse the direction of a large group of people all at once, while the small scale is hard to know because, in the case of an individual, there's just one will involved, and changes can be made quickly. This should be given careful consideration. Because matters in this fire scroll are things that happen in a flash, in martial arts, it is essential to practice daily to attain familiarity, treating them as ordinary affairs, so the mind remains unchanged. Therefore, I write about contest in battle in this fire scroll. Fourth is the wind scroll. The reason I call this scroll the wind scroll is that it is not about my individual school. This is where I write about the various schools of martial arts in the world. Ooh, can't wait for that part. That's going to be awesome. I don't know if I mentioned this, but I did several years of Muay Thai kickboxing in high school, and my teacher was definitely like into this stuff. No, I don't know if he's a full on ninja warrior there, but he definitely you could tell he'd spent a long time thinking about it. This is when, unless you really understand others, you can hardly attain your own self-understanding. In the practice of every way of life and every kind of work, there is a state of mind called that of the deviant. Even if you strive diligently on your chosen path day after day, if your heart is not in accord with it, then even if you think you are on a good path from the point of view of the straight and true, this is not a genuine path. If you do not pursue a genuine path in its consummation, then a little bit of crookedness in the mind will later turn into a major warp. Reflect on this. It is no wonder that the world should consider the martial arts to consist solely of swordsmanship. As far as the principles and practices of my martial arts are concerned, this is a distinctly different matter. I write about other schools in the Wind Scroll in order to make the martial arts of the world known. Oh yeah! Fifth is the Emptiness Scroll. The reason this scroll is entitled Emptiness is that, and note that, let me just see here, these words are all capitalized. Once we speak of emptiness, we can no longer define the inner depths in terms of the surface entryway. Having attained a principle, one detaches from the principle. Thus, one has spontaneous independence in the science of martial arts and naturally attains marvels. Discerning the rhythm when the time comes, one strikes spontaneously and naturally scores. This is all the way of emptiness. In the Emptiness Scroll, I have written about spontaneous entry into the true way. This can be fun. All right. So let's just see here. So I noticed that Bubblegum was making drawing a parallel with Pokemon. I did not know Pokemon had a god. That's funny. So, and I guess that it's true. It does have preloaded evolution because you just have to like either get to a certain level or expose them to a magical diamond or something. That makes total sense. Not, no, just kidding. So yeah, I mean, one thing I noticed lately, just on this topic, is this preternatural fear of teleology. It's like for not being religious, the level of pearl clutching is staggering. Oh, we can't have teleological arguments. Why? Uh, it's like you're basically arguing against the periodic table at that point. Why is the periodic table arranged the way it is? It's teleologically arranged. The only possible reason you could have to justify the or arrangement of the periodic table is teleological. So, where in the noble truths is there a call to action for the individual to proactively help other people? Well, there um is there? Let's have a look. Truths are suffering, um, samudaya, origin, arising cause, nirod, cessation, and maga, which I guess is the marga path. Yeah. So that is, I suppose, the helping others would be part of the path if it was anything. Then we can have a look. But you have to kind of let go of the idea of generalities. So we've got right intention, right view, right speech. Well, you can read them yourselves, but intention. If your intention is, I guess, I don't know. I don't see where it says right helping other people, proactively helping other people. I don't know where it says that. So it's interesting, but I don't know where it's sort of coming out of nowhere. That I don't understand why you think that there's a connection. So there's certainly something to be said for service, a service mentality, which is something you can read in. I guess if I was going to start to get initiated to service mentality, I would look at the Gita, the Bhagavad Gita, because it's basically Krishna chastising Arjun and saying like you're not doing you're not doing your duty. You're not providing the that service that you owe to society. You're not doing it. You're not doing it right because you're not um, confronting the incorrect or the wrong action. I mean, it's not that that's based on Buddhism or anything, but if you want to understand what a service mentality is about, it's about your understanding. You could sort of call it a belief about a belief, but it's more your understanding of your intrinsic nature. So when it starts out, it feels like it's a belief of a belief. As you go on, you realize, oh, I'm just developing an understanding of my intrinsic nature and acceptance of the intrinsic nature, even though it's a bit abstract at first to understand, and then less stumbling going forward. I mean, if we just take proactively out of there and just say, well, where does it say that we have to help other people? Well, if you have the option, if you could, and it doesn't hurt you to do it, why not? the point of something like Buddhism is to show you that a state of mind where you're in the why not camp, then the why camp is going to just be better, and you can test it out anytime you want. It's a well established doctrine. You can try it. If it doesn't feel right, it's just not the right time, or it's just not the right fit. I've heard two Dharma stories giving exact opposite message. Yeah, so that's the problem when you have something absolutist and rigid encountering something fluid and sort of more fundamental. That when you're, I guess, to me, the Socratic method it misconstrues things because it presupposes that language has access to meaning, and then it keeps presupposing it. So you want to talk about inconsistent theology? Well, maybe both sides have elements of theology that would be considered inconsistent with other elements of the theology, but there's a certain understanding that for stuff to be good, it has to be kind of averaged out. So if there were some yogis that came up with some stuff in Antarctica, pro tip, they didn't, but if they had, then wouldn't be logical to say no just because it came from a place that never produced anything good before. Yeah, so there's a wonderful net. They're hanging the jewels. Select one of these are reflected. All the other jewels, each of the jewels reflected in this one jewel is also reflecting all the other jewels. I don't like that because it's solid, and I like all my metaphors to be physical. And physical metaphors are more fluid than solid, though obviously it's a very lovely picture. But it's really funny. I think Indra is actually a Vedic god. Just from what I've seen and experienced, a lot of prolific Buddhists seem to just become ascetics and live their life as a demonstration of Buddhist asceticism. Yeah. I have no clue. But I do think it's important to see a religious institution as something that it doesn't have intrinsic value. That value needs to be maintained on an ongoing basis through service. So, talking about is it, you know, what's the right answer about serving others? It's like, it's really complicated because we're different. So, it's like the wood metaphor in the book. We're not all the same grade of wood. So, our fitting to purpose would depend on that. But there are very general trends that extrapolate to the whole system. But right now, what you're seeing is a sort of Western philosophy picking and choosing attributes of Eastern systems that is viewed as convenient to substantiate fatalistic nihilism. So obviously, it's not, you don't have to look far to find inconsistent logic. I mean, the logic actually says less than the conclusion. It's like, well, what are you looking to substantiate with your implementation of language here? I guess, you could say, well, you got points for trying to substantiate it in a language that's purporting to be objective. But are you actually embodying the spirit of that quote objectivity? Which, if we actually take that to its actual meaning, we're talking about precision and estimation, not about identification of actual rigid boundaries, which is something you can actually prove don't exist in the way that most people understand the word existence. Might work for a solitary individual, but I want to help. Whoa. Let's see here. I just want to make sure I get to all these questions. Yeah, so if anyone wants to join in, the link is pinned. You can come and say hi, and if you want to talk about your experiences with thinking about these ideas. It's always fun. to like look back and think about how perspectives shift over time and how they don't. All right, so might work for a solitary individual, but I want to help others in need, not just achieve nirvana by emaciating myself and meditating. Yeah, so I don't know who said that you had to do that, but it wasn't me. So I think it sounds very Christian to me. So there's something quite different, like original sin versus panpsychism. They're not really compatible. So I'm suggesting that the emaciated people perhaps haven't quite dealt with all of their, perhaps they are trying to die, is my point. And if you're trying to die and you can't die, that doesn't sound like very good, not skillful action, not skillful believing. And it doesn't seem to diminish suffering at all. It just seems to make suffering a guarantee. I think it's like a question like, are video games good? Well, this is the same question as like, should I read about religion? Are video games good? It's like you can twist video games into not being bad. You can twist reading a book into not being deceptive, but generally they're not great things. To think you can pull wisdom from a book is one of those things that, is pretty much understood across the board to be something you have to decondition yourself from just to get anywhere close to an accurate perspective on anything. Imagine all your life training to reach nirvana, and when you get there, you hear the band Nirvana's music playing on loudspeakers. Yeah, or imagine coming back as an animal. Oh, you're just sitting there wishing you just weren't human anymore. I.e., like you want to reach the true death, quote unquote. Wishing and wishing and wishing and wishing, and you actually get your wish, but you come back and you're like a dog. And your whole life is just, fetching balls and stuff. Serge says, I hate being alone. Hence my almost lifelong horrible marriage. Ouch. I think there's another saying, l'enfer c'est les autres, which is hell is other people. And I'm not saying I feel this way because I honestly love to be around other people sometimes, especially when it's purposeful and positive and uplifting and upbeat and all that stuff. It's great. And there's a lot to be said for knowing how to socialize, but eventually you're going to have to learn to at least tolerate being alone. And if you can't do that, you're running, and then you're going to end up being on some sort of hellish, multi-dimensional fractal, rat running thing. So it just sounds like your choice of words there. Maybe now's the time to turn it around and start appreciating things. Because, like, there's just a couple of beliefs. Yeah, they're hard because they're like, the beliefs are like gripped into the flesh on a super deep level. But, like, oh my God, when you can, you know, reframe in an appreciation, when you're unfettered by the thing, by that which shits up your experience, oh, it's, it is possible. It is possible to change. Yeah, you're not going to be a different person. Would you want to be? But it is possible to actually get a huge amount. So think of it as dominoes, okay? Now, the very first domino is something you actually have some tiny little bit of conscious access to. It takes a long time to get to the full answer, but you do have a tiny little thread to your beliefs in your consciousness. And maybe not everyone wants to do the, I'm hard and I'm hard for the purpose of being. Hey, yeah, so I don't wanna be, like, giving you, garbage advice, but maybe one day you will be a person who does not hate being alone. Maybe today's the day you take the first step towards seeing the value in working up a practice of tolerating being alone. Don't even do it. I'm not even saying start striving. I'm just saying open that door. One day, maybe it will be the case that you will enjoy being alone. You got to imagine it first, though. And I can tell you from experience that there is something really special about being alone. Being around others is amazing. Don't get me wrong. People are great. And once you get to a certain point of knowledge, like every knowledge that isn't knowledge of an individual person as universe unto themselves, I don't want to say is boring, but there's a certain sterility to it. Like, yeah, physics is great, but physics isn't gonna have some huge personal growth that it's gonna care about for its own for its own end. So I think a lot of us can relate to being afraid of being alone. Not just alone physically, but alone like if I disappear tomorrow, would anyone even notice? Would it matter? Feeling alone. And maybe there's some level of non-acceptance that that's normal. It's normal to have a very strong aversion to being alone. But it's also normal to be uncomfortable around groups of people. So there's definitely some type of inter boundary effect going on where too much not good, not enough bad. And what you'll find is as you progress, it'll just be a shifting imbalance. But the beginning of progress starts when you see the value in it. Yeah, I sure would like to be a person who's cool with being alone rather than I'm a person who can't be alone. Yeah, that's true right now. But is it going to be true tomorrow? Probably. What about in 30 days, 60, whatever? Well, the only way that it won't be that way is if right now we say, okay, maybe sometime I won't hate it. Just from my own personal experience, I can say like some of the best time ever been either with one person or not just alone, but alone in particular contemplating something that was appropriate. Anders says emptiness, as the text said, I like that concept. It points to the idea that the material world is a projection rather than actual stuff. Sure, it's very useful for physics and it's useful for embodied practice because if you want to, if you're inclined to visualize things, then if you go into a perspective of emptiness, it can, it's pretty much the same thing, at least to me, in some sense, as a balloon getting bigger. So you have a balloon that you can perceive and it's lines up pretty much with your skin as a surface. That becomes a balloon which can then, for lack of a better word, inflate. And so there's all sorts of, I guess, what amounts to consciousness technology that is basically applied some type of empty or bubble or, you know, take your word. It's sort of, I guess I don't like the word projection because I think simulation is better. And that's, I guess, because once there's something there, it's really easy to imagine the something that's there interacting with itself and then generating a standing wave. So if you already have a rigid surface, like a Cartesian plane, that can be set into motion and it's not that hard. If you already have a fluid that can be crystallized, that can, you can do a bunch of stuff to that. But if you're starting with literally nothing, which is, you know, emptiness, that's what it actually is that at most it can be made up of volume, some type of a volume, because that's really the only word we have to associate with that. That doesn't, that's not stuff. That's where stuff exists. So we're left with this perplexing question of how can stuff that doesn't exist, but that has the potential to exist in the sense that there's a volume in which it would be existing, how does that actually create what we see now? And then it's like, that's impossible. But then when you look at what's actually there, it's impossible that it's not that way. So that's why I really like it. One of the reasons I like it is that it applies to physics. So, how do we get the sun? Quantum state exclusion. What does that do? Creates space. It wasn't there before. And because quantum state exclusion can cause space that wasn't there before, you have perpetual expansion, but you also have perpetual collapse. And then there's essentially, we're looking at volumetric proportions. So, what's the ratio of the thing in which the sun exists to the thing that which exists around the sun, and so on and so forth, down to what's the volume of the Earth plus the moon compared to the volume between the Earth and the moon, for example. The argument is that since it's so much emptiness, it's probably just emptiness. The whole thing's actually emptiness. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Well, it's like, yeah, I know. But nothing else, like everything else makes even less sense when you try to implement it. Not that this is necessarily implementable, but I think from a theoretical perspective, it's pretty clear that most of the universe is empty. So on the one hand, you have this seems to be impossible that the universe could just be emptiness, but it's also impossible that it couldn't be. So again, it's just a mystery of language and an indication or instantiation of just how transcendent consciousness technology can really be. All right. Hey, memes. Thanks for stopping by. Bubblegum says the periodic table was literally revealed in a dream. So, who are you thinking of here? Sunflower asks if I've ever heard of a book called Shambhala, The Sacred Path of the Warrior. A friend of mine recommended it. Apparently, the guy was a Buddhist who drank and did um, drugs daily. I honestly don't read that many books. I find it hard to get interested in books. So probably wouldn't be too inclined to read that. Let's see. Shambhala Buddhism was originally conceived by Chogyam Trungpa as practices for achieving an enlightened society in concert with the Kagyu and Nyingma schools of Tibetan Buddhism. See, the whole thing is getting lost in titles is exactly what I'm guessing this book that we're all about to read together over the coming weeks is going to warn us against doing. Right action would be helping other people. No. Well, no, right action is just right action. So if you're saying, I'm just going to delegate right action, I'm not saying that this is what you're doing, but let's just sort of bear with me for something that you didn't say to make a stronger point here. Helping other people, is it actually always good to help other people? Sometimes it is, and then sometimes actually not. Because sometimes by doing something, okay, like you're telling yourself you're helping someone, but really you're just doing everything for them and you're giving them this huge amount of anxiety where they don't ever feel like they can start a project because you've just always interceded them, like the tiger mom thing. That's why you can't delegate your duty to actually contemplate the fundamental concepts. And if you do delegate your duty to contemplate the fundamental concepts, don't be surprised when they get misrepresented in the interests of short termism. So, a lot of times, the right thing to do, yeah, there's a strong element of service. I always say, like, you can't always help intellectually. You just can't. You can't always help um in terms of like constructing, just building up. You can't always do that. And that takes some skill. But you can always be of service because that little intention is something. So sometimes if you've got nothing going on, the right action is not to uh drain something that's already rock bottom to help someone else a little more. No, it would just be taking whatever the most apt step is in that moment, which might actually be spending quite a bit of time developing self love. That's not to say indulging in selfishness, but definitely you're the bottleneck to your ability to help others. So if you're actually still stuck in this worldview that you got to help other people, it's got to be you got to help, it's got to be always help out other people. Yeah, what if it takes 60 years out of society to learn the thing that helps people the most? You're going to put 60 years aside to learn it? Does it matter? So it's a little more complicated than just extrapolation. So, ought we help people? Most of the time, sure. But if doing so goes against some better implementation of the principles, no, you don't. You're not compelled to implement an implementation arbitrarily. And the claim that a particular implementation, remember, the implementation is suffering bad. Okay? Not sorry, the fundamental thing from which everything else is drawn as an inference is to make implementations with is that suffering's bad. So if someone's saying, well, it's actually service, but it's causing enormous suffering, well, spirit versus letter. That's why it's not that's why, like, literally, you're not even supposed to look to the written word to get an insight about any of this stuff because it's that subtle. Like, you can write it all out, but it only applies even if it's perfect. Let's say you write out whatever your canon is for whatever subject. Let's say a perfect legal canon for a particular time. The second it's done, it's society's already evolved just a little bit. So it's only that perfect. It was only perfect in that instant. And you still have to keep ahead of that evolution. And that is what we will be learning about, I feel, in the book that we will be reading, which I'm really looking forward to. It's going to be so much fun. The terms emptiness and nothingness are problematic and can easily be misinterpreted. Maybe the term relationness is more correct, but it sounds awkward. Relationness, I wouldn't go with that because we already have dependent arising. So you can think of dependent arising as like maybe maximum relatedness. That makes sense. Simulation implies a simulator of something more real. Yeah, exactly. So think of it like you start with a line and the line becomes a superposition of two, like it's a line oscillating with a fixed point in a single wavelength. So the simulation is made from something that started out as a straight line, but it never really was a straight line. It was always simulated. It's basically saying like we don't have access to absolute zero, which is a true boundary, a true fixedness, a true form. So the idea is absolute zero would be a true form if it were observable, but the act of observation interferes with it, so it's not. So we're stuck with everything is describable as a simulation because basically the same reason as why superposition is such an apt descriptor for the quantum system in advance of observation. You can think of superposition as like what is it that makes what animates superposition? Like why why can we do all these derivatives? Why does it make sense to do all these derivatives? Well, because there's this simulated motion. Well, it's not really simulated, it's motion that can also be described as a simulation because observations are localizations of what could be described as a simulation, aka superposition. Yeah, I think if we like, first of all, you kind of got to be careful. Like, you don't need to explain every last concept to every last person because you want to weigh it out in terms of the harm it's going to possibly do. So it's somewhat selfish to just think that it's only about taking lessons and cramming them down the whatever communication lines as quickly as possible. No, the more you're going to be able to do more, the better you understand it. You're going to be able to understand it more if you're more careful with it. You're going to be more careful with it if you learn it correctly in the first place. You learn it correctly in the first place if you don't implement it incorrectly. So all this like specificity and carefulness, it's at the beginning, assuming that you're not sure. But once you're sure, it's a lot more just back and forth between that which is accepted as various levels of certainty, i.e., well, how do we implement emptiness? Well, anytime we draw a graph, it's kind of empty. It's like think of a circle. There's nothing inside it. It's just a boundary. And so if geometry is or if math is like a circle, then it's something that's describable entirely in terms of mechanics that are a system that is empty. I'm just talking literally empty. I'm not saying that that itself that doesn't describe all of what emptiness means. I'm saying it's one example of how you can argue math and something abstract like emptiness or consciousness, that there's a connection in that it allows access to a more tangible interpretation of abstract things. I had an amazing experience with a Tibetan Lama. He held my hand and I felt pure energy rise up out of me. Like pure Bring water and light. Oh, nice. Yeah, I went to a restaurant that had some monks blessing it. And yeah, the lead guy, wow, did he ever have a strong presence? It was really something. The thing about helping people is like I'm not saying not to help people. I'm just saying like a lot of times when I hear that from people, it's because there's something in their own problems that they're just uh, not looking at and denial of, and they want me to come in and sort of okay the denial, and I'm not cool with that. No good deed goes unpunished. Stay centered in yourself. That's wisdom. Hey, Wave Morpher. NASA just diverted an asteroid to learn planetary deference. Pretty cool. Neat. I did not see that. I'll have to check that out. The most liberating realization a person can make is that the existence of anything at all is fundamentally paradoxical and incomprehensible. I have been so scared of that for so long, and I just figured, I can't think about this right now. It's too abstract. Now I feel like I can dabble in the paradoxical abstraction stuff, and I'm really enjoying it. You realize that rejecting the scientific theories on the origin of space-time and matter is not only okay, but right, just and beautiful. Okay, that sounds like something a 17-year-old said. But anyway, it's very poetic. Just because something isn't totally right doesn't mean it doesn't have value, and the stuff has value. To say it doesn't have value is to say that what's happened, I could argue pretty convincingly that the Pythagorean theorem is at the center of Western philosophical and mathematical and technological development. So it has a dependent arising, if you will. So just because some stuff isn't, you shouldn't expect it to be right because it's based on something that isn't right, but that doesn't mean that there isn't anything to learn from it. And realizing the prison wardens was an illusion all along, you can really walk through the prison gate. They continue. It's not quite that easy. Like, it's pretty hard. The way I would analogize it is that it's kind of like you fall, like you're on a horse, riding a horse, except instead of on the horse's back, you're on the horse's front. And your face is dragging against the ground, and the horse is galloping. So I would say that having your face pummeled, like I don't know if anyone ever watched Metalocalypse, but um, Murder Face. I think they were drunk driving, and he skidded into the ground face first. So imagine that. But yeah, it's like a horse. So it's like learning how to ride a horse while you're being trampled under one. So it's like, yeah, you're in prison, man. It's like, nah, no, I got two options. I can be face first dragging forward on a galloping beast, or I can be on top of it, controlling it. But really, am I really controlling this enormous animal, powerful thing? It's like maybe it's actually just an illusion of control. But the thing about the illusion of control is that it is very convincing, and it doesn't feel anything like dragging your effing face against the ground, which I think kind of does feel. I'm not saying that unenlightened consciousness is a constant like face F, but it's not. It has. Uh, you just never know. You never know because you never thought about it. So every bad thing is the worst thing ever because it was unforeseen. What's the bad worst nightmare than that? Jesus said something like, "Whoa, Thanks for all the comments in the chat too. Appreciate it. I'm just oh here we go. When you give to a beggar, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. I think you meant the giving help is something that can depend on the situation. Okay, so I have someone who wants to join. Hey, all right, so that's why I like StreamYards, is that it's really fast to remove someone if they're not in good faith. Maybe abstraction is a better term than simulation. No, to me, simulation is something. Okay, it's like what is it when you're walking on the road and it looks like the road is melting or something or boiling? I don't know how to describe that, but I guess it's some kind of a oh, what's it called? Anyway, the illusion of boiling on a hot day, a boiling road because of some lensing effect of the hot air. That's a simulation. Now, the simulation is made out of matter. So a, an abstraction, it's not made out of matter. An abstraction is like the word chair. The chair doesn't have the same kind of existence as the thing that's causing me to perceive the road to be boiling. The word I was looking for earlier was mirage. So a simulation is a mirage. So think of it as like something that exists is like a circle, but a circle is fixed. So even a circle is too much rigidity. So it's actually like a superposition of a circle. It's like that. But words, you got to just be super careful with words. Like right now, when I say abstraction, I don't really have a definition for that. So it's sort of fluid. But when I say that something is abstract, I mean it in the sense that it's not intuitive, but it's learnable, like math. So it would be basically like you could say that a simulation was abstract or less abstract. I think everything in this is pretty abstract. That's why I'm always trying to bring it to being less abstract with good metaphors, hopefully. Chaos theory, computational irreducibility implies a paradox for a mind that expects too much comprehension in a complex world. Um, I thought about this, and I think one way I like to express it is that a paradox, okay, language is limited in the information it can convey. And if you can engineer a language to go to encompass a sufficiently large scope of ideas, you'll get what appear to be paradoxes. And that's a property of the language, not the concept, if that helps. Not a simulation, conjugation, self substantiating evolution, where formalization is a continuous processing. Um, no Pythagorean theorem is fine. I'm talking Lawrence Krauss attempts at explaining how something from nothing is actually very simple and easily explained by science. LMAO. Well, I think like you can pluck stuff out of non-dualism and non-dualism type thought that anybody can implement, like calculator type stuff, what have you. But it's it's reductive at that point. So I can say, well, our concept of numbers is non-dualistic because we have access to infinity, and infinity is unbounded, and non-dualism describes unbounded system. Well, right there, you lost most people. So the constant repetition of Either it's got to be easy or it's worthless or it's got to feel right or otherwise it's not right. That's odd. It's very dismissive. I think you can make an argument for simplicity, for some type of a simplicity based on least action. You can say least action works really well for physics. Physics accords with least action. We accord with least action. And then there's the strong inductive step where it's like, and that means this. That's where it gets hairy. Dependent arising, something dependent on something else, dependent on yet another thing, and so in an infinite regression, hence emptiness. Again, I don't see the connection. Okay. That is not, and that's not how I understand it. So something is part of the process of treating dependent arising. So you start with dependent arising, you do some stuff to it, and eventually you get something. So it's not a bunch of somethings connected through lines. It's everything's connected, and by making observations, you're starting to disconnect it. And correctly interpreting your observations is, where did you disconnect it? What does it mean that you did this measurement? Physics and math is fine. I'm just hypercritical of anyone who tries to dismiss the origin of space-time matter as easily explained by science. I think it's wishful thinking, and that's a cultural thing. I would actually, I need to take this advice as well. Like, kind of go easy on people for doing this. This is basically, I want to say, Graham Bell, the guy who came up with the telephone, who was like, do 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 do, was sort of known for making promises that, like, basically promising to deliver on an invention that he hadn't invented yet. And he actually got some success out of that. And I suppose a bunch of books got written on it, so it sort of seeped into this whole mouth writing checks, ask, couldn't even pray national Walls checks of caching is just sort of, it's a mantra almost. It's like, if I say it enough times, it's going to become true. Our minds are so stuck on the usefulness, power, infinite creativity of language that we easily expect language to cover more ground than it can. Well, if you have no uh, alternate perception, okay, if it's just always been presuming normalcy, the first the first impression of a person, I imagine, having a realization about that idea that language doesn't actually cover, that we can't establish that our belief in the conveyance of meaning through language isn't wishful thinking. So that, for the uninitiated, is terrifying because it's like in Doctor Who when he finds the girl who's doesn't realize she's one of those Borg type egg carton monster things. I forget what they're called. Daleks. There we go. So it's like that click is just, it's just, this is why you can't convince people to pursue stuff like meditation, etc., because the first impression of an unprepared mind is this radical exaggeration of what it actually means. Like, no, it doesn't mean that everything you've ever done is just totally meaningless. Even if we do exist in like a void vortex, okay? Let's say that's the case. It still doesn't mean your life has no meaning, because your own experience obviously matters. So there's this great degree of attachment to to sort of summarize up what I take from what you said. Wave morpher is like people who claim they don't have suppositions. I don't. It's hard to sort of deny that there's some type of supposition that language can convey meaning. And then you can say, well, okay, well, it's just conventional meaning. If you accept that language only conveys conventional meaning, you basically invalidated the basis for a lot of claim. So you got to be careful with systems that have what you might call neutralizers. So systems that can make it seem like trivialize things like, oh, well, we don't really exist, man, or something. For example, like, okay, but even that, what's the utility of that? If it's not implemented on something, it's pretty dang useless to the point of coming across as like, I could see why somebody would get upset if you just presented them that information uncontextually. There was an atheist debater from Norway who used the same debates arguments you use. That's hilarious. It's like Maya in Eastern traditions that's similar to a mirage or illusion to describe the material world. Brahman is all that exists. Maya and Brahman are one. Some Eastern text. Five Rings, isn't that the samurai book? Yes, it is. And being somewhat of a martial art appreciator myself, I thought, and also I'm trying to write and get better at writing. So I thought this would be a good exercise, like reading a book on the show, as well as I made a meme out of the book without knowing anything that was in it, which I thought was rather imprudent. So I thought, let's just be on the safe side and know what the heck this book is actually about. So far, I've read, let's see here, into the 14th page, and I am riveted. I can't wait to read the whole book. The whole book is, let's see here, 160 pages. So maybe break it down into 10 shows. Ooh. Hindus don't worship Brahma because they don't see him as being fit for worship because he had relations with his own daughter. He's like the material world. Citation needed. I don't think you can explain something from nothing by science. I'm literally saying I'm hypercritical of people that say that. Interesting. Hopefully, it would open the door to a deeper conversation about pedagogy because I really think at the end of the day, we can all learn. And maybe that's the key to progress is self-improvement. Yeah, if you've ducked out already, Sunflower, thanks for joining. Ooh. Dependent is the starting point. Tricky. It's a starting point. I wouldn't even necessarily say start at that starting point. Like we're already into stuff that like I don't mind mentioning it and it's fun and cute, but if you're not seriously looking at going on an actually established path that you know people for a fact who've gone through it and they can tell you what to do, it's probably not for you. Yeah, you can do tons of independent study. You should do tons of independent study. You should be even before you take any initiation or go on a particular implementation, you should have some type of, I mean, the best is just be constantly in a state of it, constantly focused. That's the best. But failing that, you would have pretty good focus and a daily practice of something. The only thing at that point you can really do is try not to fall into any of the traps. So try not to misunderstand what's being written and try not to think of beliefs as pretty much fixed. But then there's opinions that are almost like beliefs that they're not fixed. You can completely change those. And those are like seeds that you plant. And you're eventually going to realize the belief. What if you just happen to plant the tree like 1 meter away from where it's supposed to be? You have to now either transplant it, replant it, or chop it down and replace it with a new seed. So the point is that in advance of really committing to a path, you're just really tilling soil and eventually going to plant some seeds. And then you're going to really take care of those seeds. But when you're tilling the soil, you can think about the seed. You can think about all sorts of stuff and play around with ideas. And I think it's great to pray and without begging for anything. But as a invoking of a principle to flush out any impurities associated with whatever one might be denying to oneself. And by surrendering our flaws and limitations to a higher power, the warming glow of consciousness sort of, I don't know, it just melts it away, makes it easier to deal with. So, in terms of dependent arising, I start with pretty much a hard dependent arising, which makes it so that I have a really hard time communicating with people. I have a lot of probably what most people would consider unnecessary conflict. I'm extremely rigid um, because I can actually feel the beliefs forming and dependent arising that I'm not going to really want to believe much because I know that once it's stuck, it's very hard to get out of. So I have very high awareness of dependent arising. It's just very like if you want to be focused on a dependent arising, you have to be inward focused. And most people are outward focused. And the whole I'm scared to be alone thing, like dependent arising is not for you if you're scared to be alone, because you just have to be completely like wanting to actually be fully absorbed in a singular inward experience to actually embody consciousness as minimally unentangled, aka maximally entangled, aka resonant with something dependent arising ish. The more you embody something, the easier it is to call it out for particular implementation. And then it's the particular implementations that people want. That's the trick, that there's this extra step that other people aren't seeing. So I would just say it's there. It is something that is, you'll don't, there's a saying in French, it's casse-toi pas la tête là-dessus, which means don't break your head over it. I didn't think about emptiness. I was first introduced to the concept of emptiness probably, I was definitely, it's been a while. And I haven't thought about it at all. And that's okay. Some stuff is just, don't have to think about every last concept instantly. And maybe just sort of go with either emptiness or dependent arising. And then you'll see how they're actually really not that connected as concepts over time. Scroll of Void, also good. Yeah, I have a feeling that one's going to be awesome. Brahman is the pervasive, infinite, eternal truth, consciousness, and bliss, which does not change, yet is the cause of all changes. Did somebody say unmoved mover? Trivial or magic depends on mood, attitude, not words. Well, the way I look at it is like, what control do you have over what happens? And I would class magic as just like, it's kind of like paranormal, just like unusual influence. So I guess I'm pulling that from the adage about you can't tell the difference between sufficiently advanced tech and magic and whatnot. I use what is useful to me. So I wonder if anyone ever got enlightenment from that attitude. Are we doing this again next week? Same book. Not on the same day, but yeah, sometime. I'll eventually go through the whole book, and the goal for that is cover my ass for the meme, uh, learn about how to write a book, and get inspired, hopefully, and go over some of these super fun concepts. Dark matter and battle rap. What's up? Nice to see you. Ask. We aren't ever really alone. That's a good point. I think for me, I'm definitely kind of in the getting uncomfortable alone vibe just at this point. But there's been points where it's nice to sort of dissolve into aloneness. Like I was thinking the other day, what if there was just nobody all the way out to as far as the eye could see? Just no. That would be pretty. I was just thinking like in a forest or something where there's nobody else there all the way as far as the eye can see. And then having consciousness field extend over the whole thing. But yeah, are we ever really alone? Are we ever really with other people? Well, we'll find if we pull at the thread of those concepts, it's the same thing with the meaning and so forth. There's arguments on both sides, and I think it's feels realism. It's what you think about it. What seems the seemings are not a good way to make conclusions about physics sometimes, but the seemings do matter when it's affecting your own life. The way you feel matters quite a bit. So if it feels like you're alone and you're surrounded by people, well, that's what matters. And if it feels like you're not lonely, if you feel fulfilled, but there's nobody else around, well, there you go. It's not about people. Loneliness is about, is there any hope in hell? Is there any chance of meaningful communication? And it's such an appealing illusion that the grip language has on that vector in the mind is strong. And when you go into spiritual practices, because you realize that the the certainty associated with that is not worth the limitation that the strong grip of the belief of language conveys meaning is worth. Being alone or being with someone is an illusion, but it's a powerful. I don't actually think it's an illusion. I think it's real because consciousness can interfere with each other, and then you're feeling someone. That means that you weren't alone because your consciousness is interfered with each other. Buddhism has both emptiness and dependent arising. I thought they were connected. I'll have to learn more about that. I'm sure they are, and a lot of people seem to like reason one from the other. I just cannot. I don't see it. Like I don't know where this is coming from, but it certainly needs more development to be self-evident. If it is, like to me, emptiness is like okay. Stuff has like practices cannot be expressed in words, but sometimes they have like a feeling that you can metaphorize a lot, or excuse me, make metaphors out of. So emptiness to me is like the cosmos slash don't quote me on this. It's like the cosmos slash you remember the movie of the Super Mario Brothers, like live action movie where they actually go and like the king, the mushroom king has been de-evolved, but he's giving them mushrooms and stuff and bombs to help them like beat Bowser or whatever. So the sort of wispy, the finest, wispiest little bits of the mushroom king, that reminds me of emptiness, but also the cosmos. So cosmos plus that same time, that's kind of what emptiness is like to me. And dependent arising is more like the quantum periodic table because there's such a high degree of, I guess, dependent arising is a little bit easier because it's connected with something semi, less abstract in math called symmetry. You can say, well, if something, and hypothetically in a different universe where I could actually know everything about a system, if I got a snapshot of a system in advance of observation, it would be maximally interconnected relative to its potential at a given time. And then my observation is separating it a little bit. Why? Because every observation is work, every work is going against dependent arising, so it's like independentizing it, but there's no such thing as full independence and so forth. So it's really just like you can build everything from consciousness. So everything is dependently arising from consciousness. Now, if I have an awesome model of consciousness where it has tons of information, then I get to have that follow me there. And it's awesome. So the dependent arising is the attribute of the graph that gives it its symmetry. So it's not the symmetry itself, it's that which gives rise to symmetry. So math, one of the reasons math is so appealing is because it sort of points at something independent arising that we don't normally have subjective access to. So emptiness is more like mental, and dependent arising is more like mathematical for me. And so, for the reason that I have such a huge differentiation in my understanding of them, I would say, don't assume they're the same. Don't assume that they imply each other. You might be able to make an argument for some type of structured emptiness based on dependent arising, like you could construct that out of math, but you'd need to argue that your math actually represented dependent arising, which is like, yeah, good luck with that. If I can't convince people that the QMPT represents that, just look how symmetric that is. I don't see what's going to convince people. So, levels of understanding as well. Do we need to understand dependent arising to overcome stuff like suffering? Maybe. And I don't see how. So, maybe that's something for the future to discover. Hi, Don. Thanks for stopping by. I definitely got the Big Bang vibe from it because laws of physics predated the Big Bang and dictated how the Big Bang would happen, but it's more than the laws of physics. Well, I think to make assertions about what happened before the Big Bang, given how speculative the Big Bang is sort of misunderstanding. It's the same fallacy as like everything in the universe, everything has a cause, therefore the universe has a cause. It's like the argument that everything has a cause is itself predicated on a causeless cause. So it's odd, very odd. I don't think there is any word in emptiness because word contains concepts, and emptiness is the concept of no concept. Right. So there's a necessary distance between language and the the thing we're actually talking about. So paradoxically, we can get closer to the meaning that language can't convey when we actually talk about the fact that language can't convey meaning. And then just like at some point actually it sounds probably weird that it doesn't matter that language can't convey meaning, but I mean, I think pretty easy to believe that I believe that I'm conveying meaning. I just know that language is insufficient. And so I use stuff like diagrams and metaphors, which is kind of language, but a metaphor is fundamentally an image. What if you thought you were alone, but then you realized you weren't? It was an illusion. It was all in your mind. Yeah. So there's other entities, which means that they're separated from me, which means there needs to be a binding energy to separate them, which doesn't exist. So I just heckin' debunked you. So yeah, there you go. Maybe emptiness just seems empty. Well, if it's all just emptiness and there's no actual matter, it seems to call into question something like conservation of matter. And I think that's okay. Having like at the beginning, people I think get the idea that like if you're mystified by something, you can't be good. You have to have this. Like I think a lot of Buddhists make this mistake. It's like I gotta just give the impression that I'm just so advanced. It's like, nah, I can leave the door open for the mystery. I still think there's a huge mystery, but it doesn't mean that I can't acknowledge that my models are technically empty. They're describable entirely by the small range modifications of a fixed boundary, which is what emptiness is. Empty is when you think yourself and there's no response. For every word, there is a neural pattern recognizer that is somewhat individual, somewhat collective, even for the word emptiness to abstract from an empty cup to an empty box, etc. Well, there's already the concept of just volume in physics, so that's nice. Emptiness and volume are pretty similar. You could say that maybe volume has some mathematical, metaphysical inheritance, but that's a good starting point until you realize that words can't encompass it and that there's things about it when you apply it. Just obviously, the word could be perhaps a starting point. You could do something with it, which could then be referred to in words, but you couldn't describe the actual vibe of it in words. Closest you could come would be some type of metaphor, meta, uh, aggregate type thing. The word is only a subset of Indra's net. So language is kind of, if we take ourselves as analogized as the Borg-like entities from Doctor Who, then language is kind of our little light, or no, the little eye that pops out. It's kind of as close as you can get. So language is, it's what pulls you out of your total solipsism, your total self experience, There's very little information you can convey to others without language. But when you start to get language, like, wow, you have a universe opens up to you that other people are in that universe, and wow, you can share something or not share something. And that would be so incredibly meaningful. So language is, it's all you have in the beginning. And then when you're doing the transformative work, you sort of put language on the back burner, and it's just about the process, and it's just about the transformation, and it's just about the method. And then once the mastery comes in, it's back to being about the language, because what's going to get somebody to finally come into the fold and actually hit them at the right frequency that they can hear it? Well, it's going to be something, more than likely, it's going to be something you said. Emptiness is very misunderstood. I like the take on translating shunyata to no thing, not nothing. I kind of just like the idea of going with it doesn't translate and just saying, like, everything we're talking about is with this is kind of predicated on the idea that we're not expecting to be dead on. We're trying to be consistent with, respectful of, in our own context, which does include studying what ancients thought, but also understanding that there's limits. There's limits to what we can know, because there's been, how much time has gone by, and has there actually been a continuation, and is there actually a consistent practice going on that can be linked and say, like, yeah, this is according with what Shankara said, and so on and so forth. Oh, Daryl's there. Space can't be empty. All right, well, just let me know what the utility is of thinking of space as non-empty, and we'll go from there. Sounds like a lot of people have seen Sabine Hoffman's and Miller's new video. Yeah. I didn't actually finish it. I didn't finish it because I was like, oh gosh, that's too cringe. That's too cringe. Because I have my I unironically studied the blade of this stuff my whole life. So it's gonna be cringe when someone else does it. So you're talking about like chopping something up, 10 times in like 0.001 of a second. So it's cringe when people still haven't gotten to the point of like, at least make your shit process relational. At least give it to me in a process relation. Like, please, at least show me that you understand the virtue of process relationalism, and that you don't have this, you're not porting in your illusion about language and conveying meaning into your philosophy. Please. Just a little thing, just an idea. So let's say we're getting to the end, and I guess probably no one's going to come on, and that's fine. Maybe next time. And I really enjoyed this chat, actually. So thanks to everyone for participating. It's been great. The map is not the territory. Yeah. I think a lot of us should take a break from metaphors because what does that even mean? The map is not the territory. How about this? Let's not say that anymore until we actually have a map and a territory. And we can say, hey, here's some properties. Here's some properties that don't match up. And we have this process relation for properties wherein the dimensionality has a maximum. So let's stick with that. The word emptiness makes it confusing. Maybe the original Eastern word has a different meaning. No, they're defining it confusing in the East as well. Okay, that's why it's practiced by monks. Okay, so the idea is that not everybody is a monk. Oh yeah, it'd be great if we lived in a society where everybody was a monk. I would be, you know, my bliss would be never ending. However, that's not the case. So this is this should be expected, and we shouldn't be expecting that like tomorrow everyone's going to embrace dependent rising as that which they should make their version of samurai discipline. However, we can those of us that are interested in it can ascend higher levels, and what we can uh then how we can serve societies through greater understanding of physics. And the emptiness does come into that because the more you can make incursions on the absolute, you can never get to the absolute. But if you have a solid basis of knowledge, you can make gradual, non trivial incursions towards the absolute. So, a lot of this, a great deal of this stuff is managing expectations. We shouldn't expect stuff like emptiness and so forth to not be confusing. It's actually much better to just assume that it's all going to be, there's always going to be something kind of like, what? And the point of it is not to remove the element that's like, what? It's to give you some stuff that's like, oh yeah, I can kind of use that. Oh yeah, that kind of makes sense. And then finally, oh what? That's why there's like the four corners, you know. So at first it's just a complete like what? And then you have four corners. So you have, oh yeah, you kind of get that. Okay, it's not even I kind of get that. It's I don't not get that. I don't not get that a little less. I don't not get that a little less. And then finally, what? So there's gradually diminishing uncertainty. And this is why it can't be generalized because that has to be adapted to the situation itself, which changes all the time from evolution. So that book I'm reading, not even 400 years old, and huge difference. There's words there that, and concepts there that are obviously, you know, it's Japanese, so it's foreign, but still, things are vastly different today. So yeah, it's been really fun talking about this stuff. The menu is not the dinner. Yeah, on the other hand, we could like make a competition for the shittiest metaphors. That might actually be a good idea. Like, let's think of this. The graph is not the object. Okay, so let's see if any. You're either at the table or on the menu. Oh gosh, let's try to stay away from those horrifying ones, the zombie ones. There were years of my life where I was confused as to how any tradition could claim that reality is ultimately empty. I mean, look at all the structure all around, but then I got the point. Yeah, exactly. Like, it's really beautiful because you can understand stuff about it, but also have it can maintain a mystery. Like these diagrams here depicting the quantum mechanical periodic table and hyperbolic figure eight not complement. They're empty in the sense that they're not filled. There's nothing in them. It's just a surface. Well, in one case, it's 59 surfaces that are all spherical in superposition. And in the other case, it's the form of 3 plus 1. No one understands quantum physics, right? So have fun with that. Oh, Daryl's got one. The word is not the thing. Well, thanks for joining, Daryl. I was wondering if I was going to see you, and I was starting to miss you, so I'm glad you made it. And looking forward to the next show. I guess we'll be back for week in review on Sunday, and we'll see everyone then or sooner. Take care. Bye for now.